So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this Navigating the Future presentation. My name is Ignacio Barrios, and together with Hisham and Saidi, we're going to present you our team presentation, Mexico, a pact for growth. We will be eager to answer any question at the end of the presentation. So the presentation is going to be divided in four main sections: introduction, overview, analysis, and scenarios. I will be in charge of the two first sections, and Hisham will go through the last two. So let's take a look out of Mexico. Mexico is strategically placed between North America and Latin America, acting as a gateway north-south and east-west, which has defined many of its political, economic, and social aspects. Mexico has a population of over 140 million people, is the second largest economy in South America, in Latin America, and the fourth in the region just after USA, Canada, and Brazil. It's a very diverse and rich economy with some factor, for example, is the ninth oil producer worldwide. But let's look back into the history of Mexico, how Mexico is right now here. Mexico has more than 2,000 years of history, but there are some events during history that has shaped more or less what Mexico is today. For example, the 300 years of Spanish colonization that provide them with their language today, the independence and revolution during the 19th century that defined the relationship with the United States at some point, and finally the independence in 1821. Jumping into the 20th century, Mexico during the 50s, 60s, and 70s went through a process called Desarrollo Estabilizador, which includes a policy of import substitution. During all this period, the economists called Mexico the Mexican miracle because it allowed Mexico to grow strongly during all these 30 years. In terms of economy, it's a long period of sustainable growth. But all this period that was based in very populist and authoritarian governments changed during the 80s. So, jumping into the 80s, from 1982 to 2012, all the governments applied the known as the principles of the Washington Consensus, which included economy liberalizations, trade openness, reduction of tax and duties, and privatization of state-owned companies. During this process, we can see that there is a negative correlation between the inflation on the country and the trade openness. This is more dramatic since the inflation in blue, it's in logarithmic scale, in the vertical logarithmic scale. This negative correlation for some economies is totally correlated, but for other economies, there is only circumstantial. So we let the discussion to the economists and move on with the presentation. The governments during this period, they had to face different successes and failures. For example, Miguel de Madrid enjoyed the admission within the WTO, which was a way to open the country for the trade. Carlos Salinas signed the agreement for NAFTA and the OECD. But Ernesto Zedillo has to face with the tequila crisis. The tequila crisis started with, in the well-known as December mistake, Carlos Salinas decided to eliminate the peg between the dollar and the Mexican peso. So the inflation in the country didn't take it very well. And Ernesto Zedillo, along with United States, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, and after $50 billion, well, the situation come back to the normal. In 2000, there was a big change in the Mexico politics, since it was the first time after 70 years that a new party won the election. In this case, the National Party won the election against the institutional part. So it was a kind of democratic normalization in Mexico. After 70 years, that was considered a kind of, we wouldn't say dictatorship, but a kind of monarchy of 6 years that was lasting. In 2008, the economic crisis hit Mexico very strongly, but it was able to recover as quick as this was hit. So it was a very good process. In 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto won the elections. So the institutional party came back to the power. And he found a situation after all this period of liberalization that was pretty challenging. The main aspect of this period were low wages, lack of education, a general lack of education of the most part of the society, a very export-oriented economy thanks to these low wages that make the economy really competitive, and increasing poverty and inequality. Consequence or origin of this situation were a very weak internal demand, a strong dependence on the US economy, as we will see later, and high level of corruption and violence. We can, all of us have known, for example, with the situation of Chiapas, etc. So after this qualitative analysis of the country, let's move into a more macroeconomic point of view. For this analysis, we are going to use this framework that all of you know for well, and it's very easy to understand. We can see the wages, employment, GDP, productivity, and interest or price of money. So how is Mexico in this framework? Well, it's a country of low wages, very low unemployment rate, only below 5%, so compared with the OECD countries, very positive, but with a huge informal market that occupy almost 60% of the total economy. In terms of productivity, most part of the formal market, that market that pay taxes, is based investment into sectors very labor intense. So the productivity is low compared with other sectors, more capital intensive. The country, the government at this point has been able to maintain the key economic indicators such as inflation and interest rate very low, but this access to credit has not reflected in internal demand, that it's still weak because of mostly to these low wages. So just some takeaways on this picture: low wages, export-oriented, and lack of education. There are the three main reasons that Mexico is here today, but this is not the overall picture of Mexico. There are two different phases. On one side, the formal Mexico, with a consistently growing productivity, decreasing its total part of the economy. This sector is shrinking compared with the informal sector. It's receiving most part of the foreign direct investment, the investment in R&D and investment in innovation, but has to pay for more part of the taxes that the country needs to evolve into the future. At the same time, is limited in terms of growth because of the access to the credit that is not good for a small and medium enterprise. On the other side of the coin, the informal Mexico. It's increasing its size relative to the global economy. It's creating 1 out of 2 jobs within the new economy. The productivity is consistently falling during the last 15 years. There are a lot of costs and a lot of problems to make this sector shift into the formal sector because of regulatory framework, taxes, whatever. So it's a situation that needs to be addressed, and the government tried to act out of this point. So when in 2012 Enrique Peña Nieto reached the power, he gathered all the 3 main parties and decided to sign what is called Pacto por México. Pacto por México is a political, economical, and social agreement that is aiming to boost the growth and the prosperity of the country during the next year. And it's based in 5 main pillars: rights and freedoms, economic growth, justice, transparency and accountability and corruption, and democratic governance. So all these 5 pillars are developed in 95 initiatives that in theory might change the view that we have of Mexico right now. How this would change for the future? Well, in terms of wages, it's expected that the wages will grow during the next year. At the same time, with incentives like the universal social security system, there are incentives for people to shift from informal to formal market, with some benefits such as health coverage, unemployment insurance, pension funds, etc. That already, right now, it doesn't exist in Mexico. So there are the reasons to make this change happen. In terms of productivity, with the reform in education, the country is aiming to change the investment in labor-intense sectors to capital-intense sectors. So the productivity obviously might increase at this point. While the productivity is increasing, the wages are increasing, the internal demand is increasing, so the country would reduce its reliability into the export sector, increasing the internal demand. At the same time, the task of the government is assure that the credit for these new companies, these small and medium companies within the country, keep on being cheap, the inflation is under control, and the situation has been it's been during the last 5-6 years. All this situation and all these reforms obviously need a big accountability on the side of the government. Further liberalization, further reforms in education, and trying to boost internal demand. Reduction of inequality and reduction of poverty, it seems to be logical outcomes of this situation. But is the government really prepared for this process? Well, according with the Global Competitiveness Report of the World Economic Forum, the government is doing well at some point, but not so well at others. For example, there is a big protection for the stakeholders and investors within the country, but in terms of confidence and in terms of government regulations, in terms of crime and violence, the government is not doing so well. So it seems that there is still a long way ahead before the situation will be normalized. So I let you now with Hisham, who will explain in detail some of these aspects.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Good morning, everyone. I would like to take you a bit deeper into an analysis of the items out of the four-quadrant model that was described by Ignacio. We'll take a bit of a closer look at the main sectors of the Mexican economy, and finally, we'll demonstrate a couple of scenarios that would potentially explain what the future holds for Mexico. So I'd like to start straight away with the labor market in Mexico. As mentioned earlier, Mexico has one of the lowest minimum wage levels in the region. You can see in the light color here, equivalent of markets like Bolivia, and this is around 10 times less than the minimum wage level of the US, just to put it in perspective. In terms of employment rate, which actually refers to the employed workforce as a percentage of the work age population, which is from 15 to 65. Mexico actually fares quite well, close to the OECD average at 61%. In terms of unemployment, it actually is better than the OECD average, so it's somewhere around 5%. However, an important point also to mention, and Ignacio touched upon that this only reflects the formal market employment. So, talking about informality, of course, this is one of the main characteristics of the labor market in Mexico, and 6 out of 10 workers actually are employed by the informal sector. This also reflects the inefficiencies of the formal sector to generate jobs and attract people into this sector. Of course, it's also characterized by low skill of workers and low productivity. Another also apparent characteristic is the gender inequality. In terms of employment, men are employed, or actually fare quite high, at around 78%. However, women with 33% difference only are employed at 45%, which only means there's a potential, huge potential actually for improvement. Talking about inequalities, we move into also income inequality. As you can see, we use the Gini coefficient to demonstrate that, and Mexico actually scores quite high in terms of income inequalities. It was actually mentioned yesterday by someone in the audience that the US is also in a similar situation. You see the US here very close. But the problem that actually compounds the issue, or the problem in Mexico, is that Mexico also suffers from one of the least public expenditure on public social expenditure in terms of education, welfare, and social benefits. Right now, it's only at 8% of the GDP, whereas the OECD average is at 22%. So there's quite a long way to go there as well. Next, I'd like to talk about productivity, which was also mentioned in the four-quadrant model. You see here quite a dip in productivity over the past few years. Of course, this is due to a lot of drivers, but the main one that we noticed was the sector gaps. And an interesting example that we came across was, if you take, for example, the automotive industry, which seems like a very highly developed industry in Mexico and attracting a lot of foreign direct investments. If you go one step back into the auto parts industry, which feeds into the automotive industry, you'll find that surprisingly 80% almost of the companies in the auto parts industry are actually very small companies with 10 or less employees and running at very low productivity levels, maybe 10% of their bigger counterparts. So this is also an issue helping to compound this problem. The government has put in place the PDP, Productivity and Democratization Program, which aims at, they call it democratizing the productivity. This is just a fancy word for saying inclusive growth and expanding the middle class of Mexico. And a second main strategy is to have a near and modern government, to modernize the government somehow, and also to tackle the gender inequalities as described earlier. So, in terms of productivity and looking a bit closer into various sectors, we see here, not surprisingly, that manufacturing and agriculture fare quite highly in the change in productivity, so they score quite high on productivity. However, this productivity means also decreasing in the share of employment, which is not too positive also for the economy. On the other end of the spectrum, we look at sectors like the financial services. They are attracting more labor right now. However, the productivity is quite low. So ideally, the economy would like to see more of these sectors move into the productive and with less change in share of employment for more stability. So just taking this picture into the next one, which is foreign direct investment. So again, manufacturing is one of the most productive. Looking at foreign direct investment, Mexico has actually maintained quite a high and stable flow of foreign direct investments throughout the years. And not surprisingly, around 60% of that goes into manufacturing. So is it because the sector is productive, or is it because of the foreign direct investments that the sector actually became productive? So this is a debate for you to consider. Another also interesting sector is the wholesale and retail trade, which actually takes around 10% of the share of foreign direct investments and generates around 20% of employment in Mexico. So what does that mean in terms of the economy and in terms of the different sectors? Mexico has actually quite improved on many sectors. If you look at aerospace industry, for example, which mainly exports to the European Union and the US. Automotive has also been quite a very strong sector over the years. Interestingly, 1 out of 8 cars sold in the US is manufactured in Mexico, which is quite impressive. Also, the electronics industry has taken off quite a lot. In terms of natural resources, mining, oil, and so on, Mexico is the biggest producer of silver with around 19% global market share, which is quite big. They're looking also into renewable energy. There is a very ambitious program that aims at producing 35% of Mexico's energy needs through renewables by 2024, which is quite ambitious. And of course, oil, which is, as Ignacio mentioned, one of the traditional strong parts of the industry. So where does all this output go? Of course, the easy answer is a lot of it to the US. So actually, Mexico is the 3rd biggest trade partner for the US, only after China and Canada. As you can see, the picture is quite similar in terms of exports and imports. So Mexico relies heavily on the US market for exports, mainly in automotive as well as electronics. It's a bit of a similar case also in terms of imports. However, those are mainly into machinery and capital goods used for manufacturing. Also, something worth mentioning here is that exports are around 30% of Mexico's GDP, which could explain the next phenomenon, which, as you can see here, the GDP growth took a huge dip during the global economic crisis because the economy is quite exposed to mainly the US and also to the export markets in general. So this is something that the government wants to look at moving into the future. In terms of the balance of trade, there is a bit of a deficit. However, it's fluctuating between 1% and 2% of GDP, which is quite an acceptable level for the moment. Just to sum up the macroeconomic part, so the government keeps a very tight grip on 3 main levers of the economy, which are the interest rate, the inflation rate as well, which hovers around 4%. Ideally, they're targeting 3%. And of course, the exchange rate, which is right now under a lot of pressure on the back of very low oil prices as well. So this is struggling right now. However, it's kept quite a steady pace compared to other exchange rates in the market, like the Brazilian real, for example, which depreciated quite strongly lately. So finally, just a couple of scenarios that can explain what could be the future of Mexico. So as Ignacio mentioned earlier, the Pacto por Mexico, which is the reforms program, in case this is successfully implemented, there's a big opportunity for a lot of improvements, like the expansion of the formal market, increased welfare spending in education, which will actually drive productivity, strengthening of the domestic market and reducing reliance on the US and export markets in general, and a reduction on inequalities both income and gender inequalities. On the other hand, of course, if the Pacto por Mexico or reforms in general, not necessarily only Pacto por Mexico, derail and are not successfully implemented, this could mean that still the informal sector will expand and there will be a lot of emergence of the low value added industries as mentioned earlier, and an overdependence which will prevail on the US, and definitely an increase in inequalities in both income and gender. So we wait and see eagerly what the future holds for Mexico. Thank you very much.